substitute their own if they have one, which so far they don't. But let us debate this bill. And I hope that the bully pulpit of the President is used not just to support a jobs bill, which is so critically important, but to point out where the obstruction is. And I'd be happy to yield to the Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I just want to join Chairman Levin in his plea that we be allowed to consider this legislation. The greatest crisis we face today in the United States for families all across the country is jobs. And frankly, the President has proposed a bill that is going to help us begin to deal with that job crisis. And he's proposed for a way to pay for it, which an overwhelming portion of the country, and the polling is definite, supports the President's proposal and our proposal as modified by Senator Reid to have a surcharge on individuals making over $1 million. And so we have a bill that responds to the greatest need, paid for by doing what the American people overwhelmingly want to do, and we can't get it on the floor for debate, for amendments, and finally for passage. We are not responding, and we have been frustrated by our colleagues who refuse to let us take up the bill. And I think what the American people, the message is being sent far and wide in many different mediums, but frankly, when you go home, you get it directly, is do something. It might not be perfect. It might not solve the problem immediately, but do something. Don't just stop debate, stop progress, stop discussion on the issues that are so critical to this country. And again, we are in a serious jobs crisis. We've seen the last job numbers showing some sort of improvement, but not enough. And we have to do more. And if we don't do this, then we are going to be in a situation where, and this is one of the great ironies, the deficit will get worse, not better. One of the most direct ways to begin to deal with the deficit is to put people to work so that they can resume their participation in the economic life of this country and contribute not only to their own well-being and that of the family, but the growth of the country, the robustness of our economy, and in that way we'll begin to deal in part with the deficit. So this doesn't even serve the end of deficit reduction. Again, I want to emphasize, because I know my colleagues are here, we have a bill that has measures in it that are proven, that have been bipartisan, have had bipartisan support in the past, which will put people to work, that is fully paid for by a tax that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. And if we don't act, not only do we see people lose their jobs and not get jobs, but it'll actually hurt in terms of deficit reduction. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I want to thank the Senator from Michigan for bringing us together and making the point as clearly as we can make it, that last night we had a chance to launch maybe the most important single issue in debate that we could consider in the Senate. We had a chance to bring both parties to the floor of the United States Senate and ask for the best ideas each of us has to move the economy forward. The President has a plan. I think it's a good one. I support the plan. And I think that it's a reasonable way to move this economy forward and put people to work. But it is the nature of the legislative process that some will disagree with that one aspect of it, some with others, and members may have their own ideas to bring to the floor. That is what this branch of government is all about, that we have this debate, an open debate, Democrats and Republicans on the floor, and at the end of the day, vote on something to move forward with together. But last night, not one single Republican senator would join us in an effort to bring this matter to a debate on the floor. In fact, as the senator from Michigan has made over and over again, the point that the Republican filibuster requiring 60 votes to break the filibuster is really stopping the majority from acting in the United States Senate on the issue of creating jobs, a Republican filibuster. And that is problematic, it's troublesome, it's frustrating, because I'm sure in Michigan, where you have been racked for years now with unemployment and businesses struggling, we have similar problems in Illinois. 14 million Americans unemployed across the board. You take a look at what the senator from Kentucky comes and tells us every day as Republican leader. He tells us that one of the big problems with this bill, as he sees it, is that it's paid for. He doesn't like the fact that President Obama has paid for it. Certainly doesn't like the way he paid for it. And the way he paid for it is to impose a surtax on people making more than $1 million a year of 5.6%. That generates enough revenue over a 10-year period of time that we can give a payroll tax cut to working families across America, and we can provide tax incentives for businesses to hire unemployed veterans and people who have been out of work for a long time. The money generated from that millionaire's tax is going to end up allowing us to save, in my state, 14,000 teacher, firefighter, and policeman jobs that otherwise would be lost. It'll allow us to put money into modernizing our schools, which we need to do in Illinois and across the country, in Minnesota and Michigan, in Montana, in every state, and to build the basic infrastructure that America needs to be successful. Senator McConnell has said over and over again he will not agree to this tax hike. Let's take a look at what middle-class, middle-income Americans are paying as an effective federal tax rate as opposed to the wealthiest in America. The point made over and over by President Obama, and a point worth repeating today, middle-class families in America, people making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, have an effective federal tax rate of 14.9%. The wealthiest 1%, those making over $1 million a year, their effective federal tax rate 12%. 14.9% for middle-class families, working families, 12% for the wealthiest. What's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with it is that working families across America struggle paycheck to paycheck, and they are paying a higher federal tax rate than the wealthiest people in America. I think everyone in America has to sacrifice. Now, I know some of the most vulnerable in America can't. Physically, mentally, they cannot rise to this challenge, but the rest of us, for goodness sakes, have to be prepared to sacrifice. Working families are already sacrificing, living paycheck to paycheck. To ask the wealthiest people in America who are comfortable in this country because of the greatness of our economy, this open and transparent system, this rule of law that we have, to ask them to pay a little more so that America can move forward is not unreasonable. And I would say this, in the end of the day, when the economy picks up and moves forward, and it will, the folks in the highest income categories are going to do quite well then, as equally well. You know, it's just the bottom line here. They're going to do well. The ones I've run into, the ones I've talked to, who are fortunate enough to be in that category, I know a few of them, say, this isn't unreasonable, Senator. Why do the Republicans oppose $1 in additional taxes to get the American economy moving forward? But that, of course, is the reason the Senate Republicans, not a single one of them, would support bringing this jobs bill from the President to the floor. And the second reason is fairly obvious. It's the President's plan. And for many of them, they're in full campaign mode now. They don't want to give this President anything that looks like a victory. So they're going to vote for anything that has his name on it. In fact, they will oppose things which historically they have supported. When President Bush came forward with his own stimulus plan to create jobs, supported by the Republicans, it had a payroll tax cut in it, Senator, a payroll tax cut for working families. It also had tax breaks for businesses to hire the unemployed. That's what President Obama proposes, and now the Republicans have said, oh, we liked it as a Bush plan, we don't like it as an Obama plan. What's the difference? The name. I don't think the American people are going to cut us any slack if they believe that we're spending more time designing bumper stickers for next year's election than we are in designing an economy that moves this country forward. I think they expect us. They demand of us that we respond to this. And when the Republicans impose a filibuster on President Obama's Jobs Act, it's just wrong. Let us have, as Senator Reid asked for last night, let us have the motion to proceed. Let's get on this matter, and let's do it this week. I want to say a word as well. Senator McConnell comes to the floor frequently and says, whoa, there's a big jobs bill coming up, the trade agreements. Well, listen, trade agreements can expand opportunity for the sale of goods and services. That's a fact. But when you look at the scheme of things and look at these trade agreements, The proposal I've read says that the South Korean trade agreement would expand U.S. exports by $10 to $11 billion and support up to 70,000 jobs. That's a lot of money and a lot of jobs, except when you look at the universe. $10 to $11 billion in additional exports to Korea at a time when we have a $15 trillion economy? Good, but not good enough. We need to make sure that we're expanding jobs at a greater rate to get people back to work. The other two trade agreements are much smaller in comparison. So to argue that these trade agreements are the engine that will pull us out of the ditch and drive the economy forward is to completely overstate the positive impact which they might have. So I would say to my friends on the Republican side, don't believe that voting for a trade agreement that generates $10 billion more in exports and 70,000 jobs will solve the problems we face in America. Yesterday I went to a place called Career Tech in Chicago, funded by the federal government, an effort to take people who've been out of work for a long time and get them back in the workforce. They're introducing workers who had successful careers at businesses that closed to a new world, the world of social media, the world of information technology. And they're learning, and with that new education and training, they're getting new jobs. And I asked them about what life was like unemployed, and some of them have been out of work for over 2 years. I said to them, you know, the President wants to extend unemployment benefits for those out of work. A lot of folks on the other side of the aisle are saying, oh, we already tried that. We're not going to try that again. I said, what would have happened to your family without unemployment benefits? And to a person, they said, I'm not sure if we could have survived. And they meant basically making the mortgage payment, paying the utility bills, putting food on the table, the basics. So if the Republicans are opposed to unemployment benefits for those who can't find a job no matter how hard they try, unfortunately that's going to have a devastating impact on working families across America. And just for a footnote here, I asked each one of them, what happened to your health insurance when you lost your job? They lost their health insurance. Think about it, Mom and Dad. Think about your responsibility to one another and to your kids with no health insurance. I mean, that's what happens to an unemployed person. Life is not a crystal staircase for these folks. They're just basically trying to get by and find a job. We need to help them. It's time for the Republicans to stop the filibuster and bring the Obama jobs bill to the floor. If you have better ideas, present those ideas as amendments. Our people will present their ideas. Let's have a full-throated debate about moving America forward. But for goodness sakes, let us not stop the American economy cold in its tracks in an effort to preserve a Republican filibuster. It's time for us to move together in a bipartisan nature as a Congress on both political parties. I thank my colleague from Michigan for bringing us together for this conversation. There's nothing more topical or more important that we face. I yield the floor.
Without objection. The materials are to be placed in the appropriate place in the record.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I would certainly yield to the Senator from Montana, but I would like to ask that we set an order. I thought I was scheduled to speak, but apparently it's up in the air. So I would defer to the Senator from Montana and ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to follow him.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, the English poet Thomas Gray once said, commerce changes the fate and genius of nations. The United States has always understood that commerce improves our fate and sharpens our genius. We know that opening the channels of commerce creates new opportunities. It creates new ideas and forms new partnerships. We know that global commerce makes us more competitive, more innovative, more productive. It's also sometimes more difficult. Today, the Senate has an historic opportunity to build on this legacy by approving our free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. These agreements will increase exports of U.S. goods and services. They'll create tens of thousands of good-paying American jobs. They'll bind us even more closely to three important allies. Colombia, especially, has returned from the brink of becoming a failed state to being the third largest economy in Latin America and one of its most respected leaders. It's astounding, Mr. President, just how far Colombia has come. A lot further to go, but considering the state of Colombia 15, 20 years ago with narcotics trade and the paramilitary forces and all the assassinations, it is amazing how far Colombia has become, and a lot of it goes to the courage of the Colombian people and especially to their leaders. It's not been easy, to say the least. The country of Panama is at the crossroads of global commerce and is among the fastest-growing economies in the Western Hemisphere. And South Korea, the world's 15th largest economy, our 7th largest trading partner, is also a strategic ally in a very volatile region of the world. Now more than ever, we need to expand commerce and improve our economic fate. Clearly, with unemployment at 9.1%. Our economy is growing too slowly. Consumer demand weak. American workers, farmers, and ranchers desperately seeking new markets and new customers for their products. The Colombia, Panama, and South Korean trade agreements will help U.S. exporters gain new customers in 3 lucrative and fast-growing markets. They will increase U.S. exports by up to $13 billion each year. They'll boost our gross domestic product by more than $15 billion, and they'll support tens of thousands of urgently needed American jobs. It will help the jobs picture. Clearly not solve it, but help. These agreements will help folks like Errol Rice, a 5th-generation cattle rancher from Helena, Montana. Earlier this year, Errol testified before the Finance Committee on the importance of the South Korean trade agreement. He told us that South Korea is the 4th largest market in the world for U.S. beef. It's growing rapidly. Errol welcomed the commitments I secured to increase funding for market promotion and fully implement our bilateral beef import protocol. But he understood that our position in the South American market is at risk. Australia, a large beef exporter, is racing to conclude its own trade agreement with South Korea. By approving our agreement with South Korea today, we will help Errol and all American ranchers maintain their competitive edge, increase sales, and create jobs in their communities. Trade agreements improve our economy only if they create a level playing field for U.S. exporters. We cannot allow our trading partners to gain an unfair advantage by failing to respect worker rights or protect the environment. And that's why the Colombia, Panama, and South Korean agreements include robust labor environmental commitments. These were basically made in May 2007, called Labor Environmental Framework. That's included in these agreements. The commitments require our trading partners to uphold internationally recognized labor rights, including the right to organize and including the right to bargain collectively. That's in the agreement. They also require our partners to protect the environment. These obligations are fully enforceable, just like the commercial obligations in the agreements. In many cases, our free trade agreement partners have gone the extra mile to meet our high standards. Colombia is a good example. Many of us are concerned about labor violence in Colombia. We believe that the death of even one union member is one too many. But I would urge my colleagues to consider the progress that Colombia has made in recent years and the commitment of the Colombian government to continue that progress. Colombia demonstrated this commitment in April when President Obama and the Colombian President Santos agreed to the Labor Action Plan. In that plan, Colombia made specific and groundbreaking commitments to strengthen worker rights, protect workers from violence, and prosecute the perpetrators of violence. And Colombia has fulfilled every single commitment to date. It has hired 100 new inspectors to enforce worker rights. It has cracked down on abuses of cooperatives. It expanded protection of union members. It has sentenced to prison 47 people found guilty of killing union members. There is still more to be done, Mr. President. I'm not going to stand here and say that's not the case. But Colombia has demonstrated remarkable progress. By approving the free trade agreement, we'll be able to enforce labor rights in Colombia, including the rights addressed by the Action Plan. If we reject the agreement, we lose our ability to ensure that labor conditions in Colombia will continue to improve. Very important point, Mr. President. Other countries' trade agreements with Colombia do not have the labor protection provisions. The U.S. Colombia Free Trade Agreement does have labor protection provisions. They're very strong. So if we do not ratify this agreement, then workers in Colombia will not be protected because other agreements don't protect them. These trade agreements will also help us rise to the challenge of China. Today, China is the #1 trading partner for South Korea and the #2 partner for Colombia and Panama. If we approve these agreements, we will give American exporters a leg up on competitors from China and other countries. And if we reject them, China's advantage and influence in these markets will only grow. And after we approve these agreements, we should begin thinking about the next steps for our trade agenda. We should invite our new free trade agreement partners to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the TPP. We need to negotiate a Trans-Pacific Partnership agreement, extend these agreements to better facilitate even more jobs in America. Colombia, Panama, and South Korea have demonstrated they are willing to make the far-reaching commitments our trade agreements require. And their participation in the TPP negotiations would help us achieve a high-standard 21st century agreement that spans the Pacific. Thomas Gray was correct when he said that commerce changes the fate and genius of nations. There's no better example than the United States. We have benefited greatly from trading with foreign nations. In these tough economic times, we need to embrace these benefits now more than ever. For the sake of American exporters seeking to grow and create jobs, let's approve these free trade agreements. One final point, Mr. President. I think it's fair to say, as we engage in commerce worldwide with countries around the world, we are not Simon Pure. We don't wear white hats. Other countries are not Darth Vaders. They don't wear black hats. But it is true that the shade of gray of our hat is a lot lighter shade of gray than the shade of gray of their hats, which is a darker shade of gray. It's especially true in some South American, Asian countries and African countries, a little less true maybe now in European countries. These agreements are no-brainers. They are no-brainers. Why do I say that? I say that because with respect to Colombia and Panama, products, goods, services coming into our country today are virtually duty-free. Virtually no tariffs or non-tariff trade barriers. There is some minor exception, but virtually. On the other hand, American products going to those countries today face very high tariffs and trade barriers, especially in agriculture, but also in manufacturing goods. The figures are quite stark, frankly. With respect, so it's a no-brainer. These really are, for the first time, virtually free trade agreements. It's a freebie, basically, for United States exporters and for American companies exporting products into Colombia and to Panama. They are really free. With respect to Korea, it's very similar. Korean manufacturing tariffs, as tariffs that Korea has on U.S. goods, are more than twice as high as U.S. tariffs are on Korean manufactured goods. More than twice as high. Tariffs that U.S. companies face when trying to export to Korea are twice as high today as are tariffs that Korean manufacturers face when they try to sell products here in the United States. And the average Korean tariff on U.S. agricultural goods is 54%. The average tariff on American agricultural goods that we're trying to sell over in Korea is 54%. That's about 5 times as high as the tariff is on Korean agricultural products that they attempt to ship over to the United States. That's why this is a no-brainer. This is so simple. Everybody would be for this. It does create a more level playing field. And I urge my colleagues to support this. When they read the agreements and understand the terms of the agreement, I mean, it's just this thing should go through with no opposition because we are, in fact, help American jobs. The only slight little wrinkle I hear about is Colombia. I can tell you, I've been to Colombia, and when you visit recently, when you're in Colombia, I know their leaders, their past 2 presidents, it is clear that Colombia has made huge progress. Huge progress. And if we reject this, I submit that the progress that has been made thus far will slip, and conditions in Colombia will start to deteriorate. We must pass these three agreements. And I might also add that the U.S. geopolitical position in South America is critical, and if we adopt this agreement, that will enhance American geopolitical position in South America. And if we don't do it, Colombians are going to say, we've given up on the United States. We've been trying to negotiate this agreement with the United States for 5, 6, 7 years. We give up. Then where's Colombia going to go? Next door to Venezuela? Embrace China more? We must pass these agreements. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I too rise today to speak in favor of the pending free trade agreements with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. More than 50 million Americans work for companies that engage in international trade. Currently, U.S. exporters operate at a distinct disadvantage in countries where U.S. goods face high tariffs or discriminatory regulations. Passage of these three free trade agreements will erase those disadvantages and allow our American businesses to compete on a level playing field in the global marketplace. For far too long, these trade agreements have sat on the President's desk. This delay has hurt our competitive advantage and cost American jobs. Moreover, the administration's slow walk of these bills has encouraged some of our major trading partners to go forward and quickly negotiate on their own the agreements with these three countries, putting their workers at an advantage over U.S. workers. Canada has already approved trade deals with both Colombia and Panama. The European Union has passed agreements with all three countries. Canadian and EU workers and farmers are reaping the advantages of greater access to these markets. Creating jobs, increasing investment, and growing the U.S. manufacturing and farming sectors should be our top priority. With a 9.1% unemployment, this is a no-brainer. Export more, make our products more competitive by lowering the tariffs, and create jobs in America. What could be more clear? If we fail to act, American businesses will continue watching from the sidelines as other countries enjoy duty-free trading and continue to gain an advantage over American companies and employees. It has been estimated that failure to implement just the Colombia and South Korea free trade agreements would lead to a decline of $40.2 billion in U.S. exports. The net negative impact on U.S. employment from these trade and output losses could total nearly 400,000 jobs. Small businesses in America will be the largest beneficiary of these free trade agreements. These are the businesses that account for the largest group of U.S. exporters. Indeed, more than 97% of the U.S. companies that export are small businesses, and they account for 1/3 of the total U.S. merchandise exports. Our farmers and ranchers will also benefit from these agreements as the exports of our agricultural products have historically suffered from high tariffs and other non-tariff barriers. South Korea. The South Korea Free Trade Agreement will be America's largest free trade agreement in Asia. South Korea is our nation's 7th largest trading partner, and the United States is South Korea's 3rd largest trading partner. The White House has estimated that when the free trade agreement with South Korea is fully implemented, U.S. exports to South Korea will increase by $11 billion annually and add as many as 70,000 U.S. jobs. Among the U.S. industries and workers that will benefit, the pending agreement will open the door for increased U.S. exports to South Korea of our automobile products. Mr. President, it should also be noted that approval of this free trade agreement will send a strong message that we stand with our allies in Asia and will further strengthen our long and positive relationship with South Korea. Panama. right here in our own hemisphere, the implementation of the U.S.-Panama Free Trade Agreement will guarantee American companies access to Panama's $21 billion in services. This includes priority areas in financial, telecommunications, computer, distribution, express delivery, energy, environmental, and professional services. Once implemented, 88% of U.S. commercial and industrial exports to Panama will become duty-free. The remaining tariffs would be phased out over a 10-year period. We need to act now in order to preserve current exports to Panama and pave the way for more. Panama has recently signed free trade agreements with Canada and the European Union. Colombia. Nearly 5 years have passed since the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement was signed by the United States and Colombia on November 22, 2006. Last year, U.S. exports to Colombia totaled $12 billion, with many of those subject to the high tariffs. Our exporters have paid nearly $4 billion in tariffs duties to Colombia since that agreement was signed 5 years ago. The Colombian Congress approved the free trade agreement less than a year after it was signed. After 5 years, the U.S. Congress is only now finally considering this agreement. Mr. President, that is not the way to treat a friend. With passage of the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, 80% of U.S. exports of consumer and industrial products to Colombia will be duty-free immediately, with remaining tariffs phased out over 10 years. The U.S. International Trade Commission has estimated that this agreement will increase the U.S. gross domestic product by $2.5 billion. On another front regarding Colombia, they once had one of the worst drug cartel problems in our hemisphere. With their determination and integrity, and with our help, Colombia's government and law enforcement system have substantially cleaned out the Medellin and Cali drug cartels. To acknowledge their sacrifice, Mr. President, this should have been the easiest of the free trade agreements to quickly have confirmed. And, Mr. President, we've waited 5 years as their country has done so much for itself to clean up the cancer in their system. We should have done this 5 years ago. So I hope that there is no hesitancy and that there is an overwhelming support in this Senate for this free trade agreement. In conclusion, Mr. President, with so many American businesses and workers struggling during this prolonged economic slump, it should be the easiest thing we do to enact these 3 free trade agreements. Exports support millions of jobs in this country. These agreements will promote American sales and markets where we have been at a disadvantage for too long. It was disheartening that this administration has let these agreements languish for many months without taking action. We now have the chance to approve those that are before us today, the 3, which is good for our bilateral relations with these 3 countries, for working Americans, for farmers and ranchers throughout our system, and for our struggling economy. Mr. President, I am very pleased that these votes are being scheduled for today. We know the South Korean president is going to address a joint session of Congress tomorrow, and to have these be done and hopefully signed by the president when the South Korean president comes, I think is the welcome gift that he has been looking for a long time. I so look forward to having these 3 free trade agreements with these countries that have shown that they want to do business with America. They want to have free and fair access into their country from our great products and our great workers and we should let them do it without further delay. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the following members of my staff be granted floor privileges for the remainder of today's session: Ellie Zepnik, Alex Glass, Paula Berg, Matt McElvanna, Mara Dugan, Sean Bills, Adam Goodwin, Zach Maliv, Lauren Overman, and Evan Schatz.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for morning business for 12 minutes.
Without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as every one of our colleagues knows, so much of what we do here depends really on the hard work and commitment of the dedicated staffers who toil behind the scenes on behalf of us and the constituents we represent. So I wanted to take a few minutes here today to recognize a member of my own staff who's been with me for many years through good times and bad, and whose work ethic and competence, intelligence, and passion for public service is truly deserving of admiration and recognition as she now moves on to a new job after more than 10 years of service in my office. Alex Glass came to work for me on April 2nd, 2001. We hired her on as a deputy press secretary. She'd graduated from Bryn Mawr the year before and had gone to work for the Gore for President campaign before joining my staff. Alex was like many young people who make their way to our nation's capital after college. She was passionate about public service, wanted to make a difference, cared deeply about her country and the serious issues we faced. From the start, I knew that Alex was a strong addition to my team, but just a few months later, it came clear to me that she was much more. It was a Tuesday morning. We were right here in the nation's capital. My communications director happened to be traveling that week, so even though Alex had just joined my staff, she was my only press staffer that was here that day. Well, as we all remember, a little bit after 9 a.m., we got word here in the Capitol that planes had struck the World Trade Center. Shortly after that, I looked out the window of the Capitol and saw black clouds of smoke filling the sky above the Pentagon. September 11th, 2001, a day of unspeakable tragedy and devastating loss for our nation. For those of us here in Washington, D.C., and those in New York, and for families across America, it was a day of great confusion, uncertainty, and fear. On that day, Alex stepped up for me. She stepped up for our office, and she stepped up for our constituents. Alex felt the same way every one of us did that day, but right away she realized that families in my home state of Washington were going to want to hear from their elected official in this time of national crisis. She was calm, she was collected, and she was already thinking ahead to what we were going to need to do that day. So before we even evacuated, she quickly scribbled down the phone numbers of the major press outlets in Washington State. And then throughout that dark day and into the night, Alex and I stayed together, and through our state's press, I was able to reach out to families who were desperate for news and who needed to know that despite this tragedy, their government remained strong. That day, I knew what Alex was made of. And I saw that spirit and dedication again and again over the next 10 years. Because Alex always knew what this job was all about. It was about helping people and solving problems. I remember so many times I was in the room with my staff and we were discussing one issue or another, and every once in a while we would hear a soft voice from the chair to my left. Alex only talks when she has something to say. And in the clearest and most concise way, she would help bring our discussion from the theoretical to the practical. How does this affect families in our state? How will these policies help the people that I was sent here to represent? These were the questions that were always on Alex's mind because she knew that those were the most important questions to me. So many times over the years, I'd wake up and check my email and see an article that Alex had forwarded to me. Stories about veterans who weren't getting the care that they deserve, workers who couldn't find a job, families falling through the cracks. She didn't include a comment with those stories. She knew she didn't have to. She just passed them along because she knew I would want to see them. And she understood it was those people, the ones in those stories, who I came to D.C. to fight for. Alex isn't from Washington State, but she dove into her adopted state with gusto. And within a few months, she knew more about the issues facing our local communities than most of the people from Washington. I remember one time, and I never thought I'd tell this story out loud, but Alex and I were in Port Angeles, and someone thought it would be a good idea for us to travel in a helicopter to our next event. Well, it may have been a good idea, but Alex and I, 5 feet tall, both of us, had to put on these bright, huge orange flight suits that were made for someone much bigger than either of us. And I just remember catching her eye, and we started laughing at each other and at ourselves. She and I had so many moments like that together, because Alex is very serious about her work, but she doesn't take herself seriously. She's much fun to be around, and she has a fantastic sense of humor, which is good for me, because I don't think there's anyone I've spent more time with in my car traveling around in Washington State than Alex. On a particularly stressful or long day on the road, she would always make sure we had cookies in the car, which I very much appreciated. And once during a busier day than usual, I remember Alex and I having a conversation about all the fun places that we had to pass by in the car as we drove to the next events, but never had time to stop and visit. We resolved to find the time to visit some of those when things got a bit slower, and I haven't forgotten about that. One day, Alex and I are going to visit that alpaca farm up in Skagit Valley. Alex also knew that there was nothing I liked more than doing events where I could wear my jeans and tennis shoes. And I know she fought hard to make sure that that happened as often as possible, and Alex, I appreciate that. You know, Alex always had my back. She was ready always to get done what needed to get done. Back in 2004, I was facing a tough re-election campaign in my state. Alex had a life here in D.C., but I went to her and I asked her to move out to the state to help me. I wanted her there, not because she's just good at her job and knows my voice so well, though she certainly is and does, but because she shares my values. And I had every confidence that she would know exactly how I want to tell my story and get my message out to the people in Washington. And Alex, without blinking, said yes. She packed up her bags and boxed up her apartment. She put her pet bunny in the car. I think this may be one of the most well-traveled rabbits in all of America. And she drove all the way across the country to fight by my side in Washington State. And I just don't know if I couldn't have done it without her. Alex then, after that election, came back here to D.C. and spent 6 years as my communication director. And then she did it all over again, uprooting her life, packing that bunny, driving all the way across the state when I needed her out in Washington State again last year. And after she finished that job, I asked Alex to come back here to Washington, D.C. to serve as my senior advisor and provide me with the counsel and advice as I took on new challenges. And I was grateful when she accepted and got to work. But 10.5 years after Alex Glass first started working for me, the moment came that I knew was always going to come, but never looked forward to. Alex knocked on the door of my office and walked in, and before she could say a word, I knew exactly what she'd come to tell me. I gave her a hug. We talked. May have been a few tears shed. But I always knew that Alex has the skills, the talent, and the experience to do absolutely anything she wants to do. And I'm proud that she has chosen to continue working in public service and has accepted a job at USAID. And although she is moving on, her amazing work and strong influence in my office will continue. Her words and her ideas have helped shape so much of what I've done and how I have communicated with my constituents. I can't tell you how many Washington State reporters have come over to me to thank me. They told me how helpful Alex was, how responsive, and how good she was at connecting the policy debates here in Congress to the struggles of families and communities in our state. And Alex didn't just keep this to herself. She helped build and mentor a strong team in my office that knows what we are trying to do and understands my voice and how I want to communicate with the people I represent. I've had many members of my staff come and go in my time here in the Senate. Many of them have been outstanding. Every one of them has added value and done good work for me and my constituents. But there are very few who I've become as close to as I have to Alex. Over the last 10 years, Alex, you've been like a member of my family, truly like a daughter to me. You've gone to the mat time and time and time again for me. You've been through thick and thin with us. You've sacrificed so much for me and my office, and I can't express enough how deeply I appreciate it. I know there's nothing you wouldn't do for me, and I hope you know I feel the same way about you. So on behalf of everyone in my office, all the constituents I represent, I want to thank you for the years of service to Washington State and to the nation. You've been my voice, my advisor, my confidant, most importantly, my friend. It's meant so much to me, and although I know it will continue, you aren't going away very far, I'm going to miss seeing you in the office and hearing your voice almost every day. So, Alex, as you start this exciting new chapter in your professional life, remember what Rob and I would say to you when times got tough out in the state: shoulders up. Shoulders up. You've helped me keep mine up for more than 10 years, and I wish you luck now as you tackle your next challenge with the same heart and gusto and good humor that you brought to our office every day. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m. Do I hit the gavel?
So as you heard, the Senate is in recess now, allowing members to attend their weekly party lunches. When they return, they'll continue debate on those three